And here the most common move for white is actually a losing move, amazingly, which is taking the knight on g4. So now we're going to see the idea behind that move. Hey there! Today we're gonna learn a very crazy line that we can get in the Lopez that I suggest that you try it as black at least once, particularly if you want to have some fun and you're playing a rapid or a blitz game. But if you play the Lopez as white, this is a line that you should be familiar with to avoid falling for some nasty traps and to know how to get an advantage in this variation. So after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6 and bishop to b5, we get the Lopez, also known as the Spanish game. And here after knight to f6, we get the Berlin defense. a6 is another main move. And in this position, the most common move for white to go is to castle short. And here the line that we're going to look at is the move knight to g4, which is called the fishing pole variation. As we'll see, this move has a lot of tricks. But before we move on to this line, let's evaluate other options that white might play in this position, just to get familiar with this line. Here white doesn't have a lot of options, at least in practical play. Taking on c6 in this line is not particularly strong because normally white goes for this exchange variation when black plays a6 and not knight to f6. So here knight to f6 is a lot more useful than a6 if we go for the exchange variation. So here after d takes e6, black has a perfectly playable position. For example, after d3, black might play bishop to d6, defending the pawn on e5. And just in case that we mentioned a very common idea here, taking on e5 in this position is not particularly strong because after the move queen to d4, we get a fork and black is getting the material back and even a very good position with these two very strong bishops. So in the Berlin defense, white normally either castles or plays d3, defending the pawn on e4, so the main idea of the move knight to f6 is to put pressure on e4. And here in this line, black normally goes bishop to c5, and after c3 there's a lot of theory. But since we're analyzing tricky lines, I want to mention a tricky variation that black might go for here, which is the move knight to e7. So another weird move with the knight, and this looks absolutely ridiculous, just blocking the bishop on f8, now the pawn on e5 is not defended. But one of the ideas that black has here is to go knight to g6 in order to hold the center, and the knight on g6 cannot be attacked by the bishop on b5. And there's also a very nice trap, which is the most common move according to the Lichess database, which is taking on e5, which is actually a very bad move because here black's idea is to go c6, and now there's an idea to go queen to a5, forking the king and the knight after the bishop moves. For example, after bishop to c4, queen to a5, black gives a check and will collect the knight on e5. And here white might try to complicate the game by going knight to c4 with the idea that after taking the bishop, knight to d6 is a very nice checkmate. But black can simply cover the d6 square, for example going knight to g6 or even going d6. And now after the bishop moves, b5, we get a fork and black is going to win a piece in all this sequence. By the way, taking on e5 is a very bad move, but here white can simply castle, for example, just avoid taking on e5. And now we get a fairly quiet position after a move like c6, bishop to a4, and knight to g6. Now black is ready to play bishop to e7 and then castle short. But in any case, after the move knight to f6, the move short castle is a bit more flexible because white might try to go d4 straight away instead of going d3. And here taking on e4 is the most common move. This move has been played a lot, particularly in top level play, normally leading to fairly boring games. But the move knight to g4 is a very creative try, although objectively not the best move. This is definitely a move that you can try once or twice in your games. So here the most common reaction is to attack the knight, and here black's idea is to follow up with the move h5. Black definitely doesn't want to go back and waste time. And here the most common move for white is actually a losing move, amazingly, which is taking the knight on g4. So now we're going to see the idea behind that move. Now black takes back with the pawn, and now the h file is open to create an attack. If the knight moves, for example, to e1, queen to h4 is the follow-up. Now we have an idea to give a checkmate either on h2 or h1, and there's no way to deal with that. For example, after f3, just want to mention a typical idea: before giving a check, we cover the escape square for the king, and now black is going to follow up with a very nice checkmate. And even after taking on g4, if white decides to give the knight back, black still has a very large advantage. For example, after c3, trying to cover d4 square, black could even continue playing the game. For example, going d6, leaving that knight on f3. But even the simple g takes and queen takes is also very strong for black. Black can continue going queen to h4, planning to give a checkmate. White doesn't have anything better than to go queen to h3, and even here we could trade queens and then end up having an extra pawn. We could actually capture on h3 directly with the rook after going d6. So this is also a much better position for black. So after knight to g4, h3 and h5, taking on g4, these are all the most common moves that simply lead to a win for black. So if your opponent is not familiar with this line, you might get a winning position very quickly. Now objectively, this is not the best move because black doesn't have a real threat in the position. The knight on g4 might look nice, but black doesn't have any threats here. So white can refute this idea with correct play, but as we'll see, it's not going to be that easy. And before we move on to how to refute this tricky line, let me remind you that for the next few hours only, and in honor of Father's Day, I'm giving a massive discount on all of my courses. So click the link in the description if you want to know more about this. So here going h3 is not necessarily bad, but white doesn't have to take on g4, at least not quickly. So here the move c3 is very strong. This prepares d4 and also prevents some knight to d4 ideas by black. Now the whole idea is for white to develop and only then consider taking the knight on g4. Black doesn't want to go back with the knight because this would waste time for black, and there's also some pressure on e5. But in any case, let's evaluate some of the trickiest lines that black can play in this position. Black has to play actively, otherwise going for this plan doesn't make a lot of sense. And here, the trickiest lines, I think that they are either going d5 or a6. So let's start with the move a6. This invites white to take on c6, which is not particularly strong, because after taking on c6, now this bishop is ready to develop, and again white cannot take on g4. So after a6, the best is to keep the tension by going bishop to a4. This is a very common idea that you might know if you play the Rui Lopez. And now black can try bishop to c5, trying to develop the bishop and putting pressure on f2. And after d4, the best try for black is to go bishop to a7. Now we see an idea of the move a6, that the bishop can go back to a7 and not be attacked. And here white can keep an advantage, but white has to be precise. For example, taking e5 wouldn't make a lot of sense. Now the knight on g4 is more justified. Black can take with the knight, but white can also keep the tension and go knight to a3, just developing and getting ready to take on g4 sooner or later. For example, after queen to f6, knight to c2, keeping the pawn on d4, black might try queen to g6, black will try to create complications on the king side. Now the move queen to e2 is strong, defending the pawn e4, and after a move like b5, bishop to e3, and bishop to e7, for example in this position, now white can finally take on g4. After pawn takes and pawn takes, here the move knight to g5 is actually quite strong because now we have pressure on f7, and we also have an idea to take on g4. And after c3, besides a6, another interesting idea for black is to go d5, again trying to create complications. And after pawn takes and queen takes, the queen is attacking the bishop. Here white has a very subtle move, which is queen to b3, inviting the trade of queens and also defending the bishop on b5. Black doesn't want to trade queens because after pawn takes, there's the idea to take the knight on g4, or if the knight moves, now white can take on e5, since the knight on c6 is pinned. So here black might try a move like queen to d6, and here again the main idea for white is to improve the position before taking on g4. For example, here the move rook to e1 is quite interesting, increasing the pressure on e5. And here black might try bishop to e6, attacking the queen, and after a move like queen to a4, black can try to castle long to complicate the position as much as possible. But here white can take on c6, and here black has two options to take back either with the pawn or with the queen. After taking with the pawn, now white can finally take on g4. By the way, here taking on a7 is not that clear because after bishop to d5, now black might have ideas to take on f3, but instead taking on g4 here is very strong because after pawn takes and knight takes, the queen doesn't have an easy way to go to the h file. So with correct play, this should be good for white, but as we see, white has to be very careful when to take on g4 and when not to do so. And after taking on c6, black might even try taking with the queen, and after queen takes and queen takes, even though white can take on g4 and win a piece, white has a better position, but black has at least some practical chances. After bishop to d6, now black has the idea to double rooks on the h-file, and here white can keep an advantage, but white has to be very accurate. Here the move knight to a3 is very strong, as we'll see, but after playing a natural move like knight takes c6, white is already in trouble after bishop to h2, and if the king wants to run away, bishop to c4, gives a check, and after rook to e2, black has ideas like going rook to e8, putting pressure against this rook which is pinned, or even the move bishop to f4, planning to go rook to h1, checkmate is very strong. So even without queens, white has to be careful, but here the move knight to a3 is very strong. The idea is to overprotect the c4 square and avoid bishop to c4 ideas. The game might continue something like rook to h5, attacking the knight, and after d4, now the king is ready to escape, and with correct play, white should convert the advantage. So hope that you like this idea. Keep it in mind, particularly if you play as white, you should know how to play against it, and even if you play as black, you can try it at least to have some fun. So after white castles short, we go knight to g4, or even if white goes d3, which is the other main line, black can try knight to e7, inviting white to take on e5, which is a very bad move because after c6, black will win a piece after the bishop moves, and queen to a5. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.